treatment of Ebola in a country that's very resource poor. And to illustrate that, I'm going to talk about a lot of cases, and I have some pretty, I think, moving pictures, and I will tell you stories about decisions that had to be made on really a daily basis. And I trust you that if the story's big, and sometimes I tell it and I just kind of fall off a cliff, and so I will trust you to say, you know, here, why don't we focus on this aspect? So, okay. All right, so this front step, I'm just going to quick fly through. I could write a whole entire paper on this about why I went, but what I want you to take from this slide, I want you to bring yourselves back to last August when President Obama declared that the U.S. was going to have be a big mover in an international response to go to West Africa to send troops, people, money, supplies over to West Africa. They mostly put troops in Liberia, and also committed money to the U.S. to the U.S. hospitals. I'm sure you all remember that if you're actively working. When Ebola came to your hospital in the form of training and simulation of how to triage a potential Ebola patient, how to don and doff your protective equipment. Then I want you to think about what happened in October. So then after President Obama finally declared that the U.S. was going to get involved in an international Ebola response, fully 9 months after the first case of Ebola was recognized in West Africa. But nonetheless, he did, and that was a great thing. I want you to think about what happened when Ebola really came to the U.S. in October, when a Liberian man by the name of Thomas Duncan came to Texas, was triaged, told the nurse documented that he had come from a country that was affected with Ebola, which were 3, Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. There were a few cases in Nigeria, a few cases in Cote d'Ivoire, but don't quote me. But the ones that were really at that point in the U.S. that we knew were Ebola afflicted countries were Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. So Thomas Duncan goes to a Texas emergency department. He has flu-like symptoms. He has traveled to a Ebola-stricken country. He tells the nurse appropriately triages. The doctor sees him. The doctor diagnoses him with sinusitis, sends him home with Augmentin. And he goes home, where he returns 4 days later, and of course he dies of Ebola. And a couple of nurses, U.S. nurses who treated him, were infected with Ebola. Think of what happened, number one, to nurses. If you remember, nurses were blamed. The health system blamed the nurse for not telling the physician that Mr. Duncan had been in an Ebola-stricken country. You have to remember that. And the nurses were blamed for not following proper protocol, and they gave themselves Ebola. Right? Does anyone remember this going on in the national media? It was infuriating, yes or no? Because if anybody remembers that, I mean, this was at the same time our hospitals were shipping us PPE for the first time, and I know that the PPE that I got in my urgent care center was complete, and I worked for a major academic institution, was completely inadequate, right? So that the nurses were blamed was kind of a difficult thing. But also think of what happened to the public. Yes or no, the public was hysterical about the potential of getting Ebola in the U.S. Right? Absolutely. Absolutely they were. Yes or no, the media did a really great job educating the public about what Ebola was and how, to sort of look for it and how to keep oneself safe from it, or the media did a really great job of stoking fear and hysteria. Also, politics aside, think of the context in which all this was going on. We had a midterm election. And politicians love to take people over into wedge issues. Look over here, because if we look over here, we don't have to really solve the economy and education and healthcare issues. But if we look over here in this wedge issue and distract the public's attention to this wedge issue, nobody's going to really think about what our actual issues are and what we can do to solve it. So what was the big wedge issue that led up to the midterm elections? Ebola in the U.S. And politicians stoked this fear and anxiety as well. again, politics aside, it just is true. I mean, there's actual research that exists that says this, plus we all saw it. So understand that that's what was going on in the U.S., while at that point, thousands of West Africans were contracting Ebola with a case fatality rate of over 60%. And they were by themselves with little U.S. or international support. So I traveled with a non-governmental organization called Partners in Health, well known for their work, primary care and health systems building. So not MSF is Doctors Without Borders. Doctors Without Borders is well known. They're incredibly talented, very well supplied, very well funded. There's an earthquake, there's a tsunami, there's Ebola. Doctors Without Borders takes their big jets, they fly in, they put up big tents, they do incredible work. And when the work is done, when the crisis is over, they pack up their tents and they go on to the next, okay? So, Partners in Health is not that. Partners in Health pushed into Haiti in the late 80s, early 90s, when the rest of the world ignored the Haitians and their how they were struggling with HIV. There was no treatment, there was no ability to identify. There was little going on in terms of prevention of HIV. Partners in Health pushed into Haiti at this time, and the world told them they were crazy, and you cannot put good health systems buildings into a poor developing country. And Partners in Health said, no, that's not true, and they did. And within a decade, they did amazing things to turn around the HIV rate in Haiti. And Haiti now has identification of HIV, and they have the latest treatment of HIV and prevention of HIV, bringing them in line with disease rates of other countries. Actually, they're in some of the best shape of developing countries for HIV. So that's who I went with. I knew about them because I just really respected their work. No one in the U.S. or internationally really was paying attention to Ebola. Partners in Health, Carl Farmer knew the Liberian president, and they were friends. And Carl Farmer made a commitment to her and to to Sierra Leone, which is where I went, to the government of Sierra Leone, that we would go in and partner with the government of Sierra Leone, and we would work on not only the Ebola response, but then we would stay in country for the long term and do significant public health infrastructure building. Okay, so Dr. Rita said you talked about Ebola. I'll move on. Sierra Leone, here's the bottom line. They're really poor with a really poor healthcare system, with a life expectancy of 45. So can you imagine, almost, what is that, almost half? Certainly 30 years, 35 years less than what the U.S. life expectancy is. It's important to understand they're a former British colony. Guinea is a former French colony, Liberia is a former U.S. colony, and Sierra Leone is a former British colony. So that's how the countries lined up in terms of response. And there's a huge debate, and there will be for a long time, about who did better, okay? I can tell you that I was in Liberia for 24 hours, hung out with some of the U.S. troops that President Obama had put in there, and they had a huge presence, and I felt better for it. And Liberia actually has been Ebola-free for about 2 months now. Keep your fingers crossed. Lots of debates as to why that is. I'm not so sure it had anything to do at all with the U.S. presence, but I appreciated the U.S. presence in Liberia. When I was in Sierra Leone, it was the British government that was partnering with the Ministry of Health of Sierra Leone, and they did not have nearly the presence that was in Liberia. So I just think that's an important piece to understand why which country went where. The other thing that's important is understand both Liberia and Sierra Leone had just finished these long, protracted civil wars in which the concept of sleeving was very popular. Sleeving is do you want half an arm, you want your arm cut here, you want your arm cut there. Right? It was one of the first rebel wars where you began to see these atrocities against people, where women were raped and people were maimed as a way of scaring the people, and making them follow the rebel leaders. So these countries have been through, they've been through hell and back. There's just no other way to say it. Okay, I won't talk about Ebola virus disease, but here's what I will say. This becomes important when you want to understand why triage systems were so difficult. Ebola I always say you can have a little bit of Ebola and not get anybody infected. It's when you have a lot of Ebola that, you know, you are the most infectious. Ebola has a very non-specific presentation. In the early stages, you have fever, headache, sore throat, body aches. You look like you have the flu. Actually, you look like any one of these illnesses. Must be not a red thing.
You also point it this way when you want to move the slide, because the computer's not here to do
Oh,
it.
was I just
Yeah,
talking?
no, you automatically, everybody does that. You point it up that way. Yeah, no, sorry, go
That's
ahead.
funny. You know what it feels like? I'll talk about this. It feels like the infrared thermometers, you know, the Sierra Leoneans call them the Ebola guns, because they were pointing at our heads all the time. I feel like I don't know if I can do that. All right, so Ebola looks like many other illnesses in the early stages. Looks like malaria, tons of malaria in Sierra Leone, in West Africa at this time. Not great treatment for it. Ebola looks like cholera, looks like other viral hemorrhagic diseases like Lassa fever, dengue fever, yellow fever. Ebola even looks like pneumonia. Because there's an upper respiratory piece to it. Certainly it looks like bacterial sepsis, looks like an acute surgical abdomen, and ILL, I messed up, it's an influenza-like illness, so it's again, just the ILI. Just put that in your mind in terms of why it's so difficult to make triage decisions. This is a little out of date. I was just looking this morning. There's actually some bad news coming out of West Africa. The total cases in Sierra Leone right now this week has been 15, which doesn't sound like much. When the case load peaked in early December at about 400 a week. I was there mid-December, late December. We were somewhere around 300, 350 a week. By the time I left, we were down to 200 a week, and we certainly anecdotally saw changes in how busy our Ebola treatment unit was. The goal is to get to 0 cases. Why do we want to get to 0 cases? Why do you think that's the goal?
We can contain it better.
Contain it better?
And you would know who's infected then. I mean, who would be the first case, incident case.
All right, that's not a bad thought. Who has got other thoughts about why is the goal 0 cases? Not spreading, right? If there are any cases left, that the potential for it to spread like wildfire exists. If you have a poor public health care infrastructure, which these countries do, right? We were teaching basic triage in hospitals, right? And healthcare systems, the healthcare system closed. The healthcare system, as you conceive of it, closed, which means the only care that was going on was care for Ebola in these rough-hewn Ebola treatment units, which you will see. If you don't get to 0 cases, the potential for it to spread to 100 cases, 1,000 cases, 10,000 cases, there's almost 30,000 cases. There were almost 30,000 cases in the last year of Ebola. If you don't get to 0 cases, Ebola will become, in an epidemiological term, pandemic, not epidemic. And when you have countries that do not have the means to deal with it, that really is a big crisis. So 0 cases, they're not at 0 cases. They bumped down to 3 weeks ago. They're back up to 15 in Sierra Leone. Very scary for those of us who understand that country. 3 of the cases were people that they were not even doing contact tracing or surveillance for, which means the contact tracers on the ground don't know why these people were sick. And perhaps even more frightening, one of the cases was a child was born, stillborn, tested positive for Ebola virus, but his mother was a survivor months ago. That's probably that's one of the cases that has the epidemiologists freaking out and has the infectious disease people freaking out, because there's long-term things that are going to occur that we don't yet understand. So that was certainly very frightening. So 15 cases this week doesn't sound like a lot, but to those of us who understand the trouble of getting to 0 cases, 15 cases is a lot. I have great communication with some of my Sierra Leone counterparts that I work with. One of her, you'll see her picture, Adama. Adama called this week, and she was just confounded because there's a community called Kathabulam where we had a lot of cases from when the cases were 200 and 300 a week. And Kefabulum just cannot get their caseload to a reasonable amount because of the burial practices, the unsafe burial practices, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. I got it. Okay, so this is all training. I won't go through this. Maps. This was the U.S. troop presence on the ground in Monrovia, Liberia. Originally, I was supposed to go to Monrovia, Liberia. Caseloads had dropped significant. I swear when we were in air, so about, I think, 3 of us, or there were 7 of us that went to Monrovia initially, and to do really public health infrastructure, community education, training nurses, training doctors, supporting them really more than training. And I was on the ground for a little bit, and we were told we were going to get on a UN plane and we were going to fly to Sierra Leone because they had a surge in cases. So this is my little UN flight. And you were really much a part of that. It was like, where are you going? I don't know. Today I'm in Sierra Leone. I don't know. I'm in Liberia. So it was interesting to keep up with that.
The internet gives you this capacity to communicate that's just surreal sometimes.
Yes.
Okay, where are you? I'm flying over Sierra Leone right now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
It was,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. Dr. Hebe was one of my hugest supporters. I'll talk a little bit more about this. I chose to be very secretive about going, again, because the context that was occurring in the U.S. I did not want my personal life or my family's personal life to be dragged through the media, social media, or other media. And so very few people knew that I was going, but Dr. Hebe has the misfortune or fortune of living across the hallway from me in our offices, and she's a good listener, you might know, and so she knew where I was going, and I kept her up to date. So just another map. I worked right here in Port Loko. Freetown is the capital, flew into Freetown, took a ferry across the bay, and then went on a truck into Port Loko. And where the cases still are right here in Kefabulum. And then there's tons of cases again in Guinea. Guinea has been the most difficult to get. They're the most resistant to the fact that Ebola is even a thing, you know, or they believe a lot of what we would call folklore, that international folks are actually bringing it in, or a neighbor is cursing them. And so there's been actually incidents of 8 healthcare workers, none of them they were all Ghanaians, were actually killed and dismembered and beaten to death in 2014 up in Guinea. And Guinea is actually they have the most cases and they're struggling the most because they pretty much won't let international partners in to help. And it's pretty dangerous to go in as well. We did not experience a bit of that in Sierra Leone. I love my Sierra Leone counterparts, and we were really great about taking care of each other from the very first of meeting each other. Training. This picture, to me, what's the important part of this picture is Sierra Leoneans love soccer. This is their national soccer stadium. They're soccer like we are to our Buffalo Bills, right? This is their national soccer stadium. When I say everything closed in the country, I mean everything closed in the country. Christmas was canceled. I know that. I was there. Christmas was canceled. And the reason is, why do you think commerce closed? Why do you think that soccer schools closed? Soccer stadiums closed? Why Christmas was canceled? Why do you guys think that? Right. You didn't want people close together in large concentrations of people because you could spread the disease. And then this is some of the training we received, and this is all training in their soccer stadium. Everyone loves this. I think I've lived it, so I'm like, oh, okay, it's pretty interesting. But people always give good feedback, so I take a minute to do this. This whole thing is called an Ebola treatment unit, right? It's all perimeter of an Ebola treatment unit. There's the green zone of the Ebola treatment unit and the red zone of the Ebola treatment unit. So in the morning, I enter a gate. There'll be pictures of this. And I'm in my regular clothes, get my temperature taken, figure out my business for the day, get my drugs from the pharmacy. Then I go into a donning area, and this is where you go through the multiple steps of donning all your protective equipment. And this is still all green zone. No Ebola suspect patients, no Ebola patients in there. The gate keeps only healthcare workers and people that are actually working on the response In the Ebola treatment unit, the gate is really, I mean, it's a gatekeeper really, so it keeps people out that shouldn't be there. Then after an hour or so, I'm in here, I'm all ready to go when I enter this door. And when I enter this door, I am now in the red zone. All of this is, I call this Ebola land. But it's divided into two distinct areas. The first area you're going to walk through is called the suspect ward, okay? So the suspect ward, remember the original slide where I talked about Ebola looks like everything else, it looks like malaria, it looks like pneumonia, it looks like an acute abdomen? If you come in and you meet case definition, which trust me, most people met case definition, and there was no healthcare going on in the country, so, except for Ebola treatment units, if you met case definition, you were in the suspect ward anywhere from 1 to 4 days. Someone would come draw your blood, it's a PCR test, theoretically it takes 4 hours. I had days where it took 3 to 4 days, which means you're seeing, so let's say you have 20 people in here, because they all meet case definition and they're suspects. 10 of them probably have malaria, pneumonia, congestive heart failure, an acute abdomen. 10 of them have Ebola, but they're all hanging out together, right? When we get the blood test in, then it's our job to sort out who's Ebola negative and can go out, and who's Ebola positive and then needs to go into the confirmed ward, which is there, okay? So, for treatment. So that is what makes these triage decisions so incredibly difficult. And I will tell you, the cases that haunt us are the cases where we knew people met case definition and we knew in our guts that they didn't have Ebola, but we had nowhere else to put them. Perfect example, this will make you sad, but you'll appreciate this. We had a mother-baby combination. Baby is 3 weeks old, FLK. What's FLK? Funny looking kid, sorry. But nonetheless, it just wasn't the child did not look okay, but we didn't have much we could do. So mom is really weak, mom is febrile, mom complains of abdominal pain, mom has nausea, vomiting. So we look at this kid, we know she's postpartum, the mom really hasn't had a lot of Ebola contacts, but she meets case definition by her symptoms, right? Fever, belly pain, nausea, vomiting. She has baby. Baby doesn't meet case definition other than he's sort of a failure to thrive. He's just not looking good, kind of dehydrated, real thin, right? What do we do with mom and baby? No, that's a whole nother story. We keep them together. They go in the suspect ward. Now, all of our instincts is, no, this mom it turned out our best guess was she had retained placenta products, right? And she was just very ill. She was getting septic from that. Number one, I didn't have a maternity hospital. Maternity hospitals closed. Because one of the most high-risk procedures, if you call it a procedure, forgive me, is birthing children, delivering babies. Because the amniotic fluid is full of Ebola virus, and then all the blood from the delivering babies. OBGYN docs stopped delivering babies. Women couldn't get care. I had nowhere to put these people. So, not to mention, if I could beg, borrow, and steal from the Italians, from MSF, from some other place that may have opened a facility, nobody was going to touch her until I had a negative Ebola test, which took 3 days. So the whole time, now we have a bit of treatment, we have a few antibiotics, we have some IV fluid, we have some antiemetics. We don't have ultrasound, we don't have CT scan, we don't have surgery, and we have ceftriaxone, so we have the cephalosporins, we have metronidazole, and we have ciprofloxacin. She's going septic, okay? So we don't know what's going on really. We don't have great treatment. We don't have surgery, because that's the optimal treatment, is my guess would be a DNC, right? Not a midwife. And I can't do anything with it. So I took mom and baby go in together. 3 days later, they come out. They're negative. That's when mom is so weak at this point. I have to organize with Captain Bob from the Sierra Leonean government to get a non-Ebola ambulance. the non-Ebola ambulance comes. I found a maternity hospital that has just opened in Freetown. I have to load mom, it's like a VW bus, because she's too weak to make the step up. She can't hold her baby. I have to put a box at mom's feet, literally cardboard box, put a gown in it, and put the baby in there, and pray that the driver will take her into Freetown. She made it to Freetown. The ending is not good. Mom died and we don't know baby. Because we had such, what happened to baby? Because we had such delayed treatment, because no other, very little other healthcare was going on in the country at the time. Okay, so the other thing I want to point out about this, so suspects, so we talked about suspects, if they go in confirmed, they're usually hung up there for 10 to 14 days. It's a long course of the disease. It really is. Really, actually, it's remarkable to me. What made it very difficult for us is this is one-way traffic. So if we found ourselves here in confirmed ward and someone was seizing here or had died here, we could not go back. Because you did not want to bring the potential of your Ebola now that was on your protective equipment back. So we had to yell out, there were no radios, no way of communication. We had to yell out. Many of us were mostly at the fence sort of watching what was going on so we could respond. And a whole nother team had to get suited up and come in and take care of whatever the crisis was in the suspect ward at that point, while we finished our business and we got ourselves out. Really difficult decisions that were going on, but this was just regular life, right? So can you imagine who works emergency? So imagine, right? Imagine having a 6-car pileup. There are multiple victims. But you have 2 doctors and 3 nurses, and you can only take care of a few patients. And these ones you can't until you've got other people coming in from home. It doesn't happen in this country, does it? The other issues were so few international healthcare workers were on the ground at that point, well, ever, through the whole, I don't know why I say at that point, that we had a team of 9 clinicians for a week that ran that Ebola treatment unit for 24/7, day and night. We always had to go in with a team. You could be in there, MSF recommended an hour. We always pushed it to 2. Some of us pushed it to 3 hours because the suits were so hot. It was so hot you would sweat so much. And it was just dangerous. You would pass out. And then how are you going to get out of Ebola PPE if you're passed out on the ground? Not beautifully. And so some mess would occur here. And sometimes we would have to wait for several hours before someone could come in and take care of that. So these were just the decisions. I mean, I think the take-home message is you go home tonight and you go, U.S. isn't bad. Not bad. U.S. healthcare, not bad at all. All right, so I worked in a place called the Makorki Ebola Treatment Unit, which was a partnership between Ministry of Health, Partners in Health, the Cubans, and the African Union, of which there were Nigerian doctors and nurses that were some of the most skilled, most wonderful doctors and nurses that I worked with. So the Ministry of Health was the Sierra Leoneans that were already on the ground. Partners in Health were us. They called us expatriates. The Cubans, who knows why the Cubans? People always ask me this. The Cubans have an incredible footprint into international health. They do amazing, they have actually a really great healthcare system in Cuba, at least what the Cuban government tells us. And they do really great in terms of sending their Cuban physicians and nurses to these crisis areas, and even sometimes not to crisis, just to do they did a lot of primary care in Haiti in the time that I was in Haiti as well. So the Cubans have, culturally, ideologically, they have a huge international public health footprint, and so we work with a team of Cuban doctors and nurses, and I think that's it. And this was the perimeter, and you can see Partners in Health flag plan, which was our supplier, and that's a Cuban flag. And we didn't have a Sierra Leonean flag. And this was inside. This is the green zone of the Ebola treatment unit, and these are all gone now. So our Ebola treatment unit was decommissioned as the caseload dropped significantly. It was decommissioned about 6 weeks ago. So all of this is gone. It's the creepiest picture I've ever seen, and I have creepy pictures. And all you can see are these pieces of concrete that, or cement that were laid in, in an emergency basis to build all of these makeshift buildings for our Ebola treatment unit. So, the woman with her hand up is a very talented nurse from the Pacific Northwest, Martha. She's pretty much telling the physicians what to do that day. Mark is at the board, and Mike's actually at the board. He's an emergency medicine physician, and Mark is another nurse, and they're sort of strategizing their plan for the day. Let's see, and this was, I spent a lot of time in triage for a variety of reasons. So I'm standing, I took this picture, I took all these pictures. I'm standing there, and this was a typical afternoon. These are the Ebola ambulances. These were Ebola nurses right here, which is a very loose term. The only jobs that existed in the country were the Ebola jobs. So whether that was grave digging, or whether that was driving an ambulance, or whether that was being an Ebola nurse, and they're not nurses, right? They just were brave enough to sign up to be an ambulance nurse. And it's a completely different concept than what we think of. There was no intervention. They truly sat here in this front cab. The drivers would never get out. They would yell at us through the speakers, they would never get out. The nurses would get out, hand us a piece of paper. We had so many people who came, we had no idea where they were from, what their symptoms were, what their age was what. They would just hand us a piece of paper with a bit of a name on it. It was just, I think it was more indicative of the chaos that was going on in the country at a time, rather than a knock against, the people that were working on the ambulances. The ambulances went back into the red zone of the Ebola treatment unit, and you never knew what you were getting. So, you could open the doors, and the person could be actively seizing. You could open the doors, and the person could be expired. You could open the doors, and you could have a family of 6 walk out. You never knew what you were going to receive for any of these ambulances. This was a very normal afternoon. The ambulances just came one right after the other. I call this indelible images of the Ebola treatment unit. They're not right here. These are the last pieces of our protective equipment that we put on. We took Ebola from our faces. These are the first, our wellies. And this is actually a mosque. There is about, I think it's about a 60% Christian, 40% Muslim religious groups in Sierra Leone, and it's one of the happiest. They live so peacefully together. It was such an extraordinary thing for me to see. Because the truth is I'm an American, and what do we see about Muslims? Splashed across the front page all the time, right? So they're scary to me. I've not ever really worked with a lot of people of Islam faith, or, Muslims, and so it was a pretty wild experience for me to go, oh, they're all not ISIL? I mean, it really was. I don't mean to, the only reason I say this is because I'm thinking, if I read a lot and, was there and had this experience, I mean, of course, people of, Muslim descent sort of get their they don't make out well in the U.S. press. So what I can say is there is not religious bucking heads at all in Sierra Leone. You cannot tell who's Muslim, you cannot tell who's Christian, except maybe by the name, and they all live really peacefully together, and I'm very grateful for that because they've had enough trouble in their country. Boots, and this is what I call the Ebola guns. I call this whole section indelible images. And these are the infrared thermometers, and I can tell you no matter how many times someone put an infrared thermometer to my head, it never got more comfortable. 2 things. Number 1, you can't see, right? So just think of it. Just think of it. If you're a little twitchy anyway, and someone comes to the side of you with a gun, right, and has to get really close to take your temperature, it's not a great feeling, right? Number 2, if I had a fever, that was going to set off an entire chain of events that I did not want to be a part of. So this was Abdul, and Miss Abdul, very carefully documenting our names and our temperatures, and every morning he would say, Amanda, 36.6, very good. And I would feel like I could have a good day, because Abdul waved me off, and it was okay. So, yeah. And then these are chlorine buckets everywhere. You're not supposed to enter any place in the Ebola treatment unit without washing your hands. This is 0.5% chlorine. Doesn't burn. The chlorine that you will see at some point that goes on your protective equipment is 5% chlorine, and that burns. Bathrooms. Okay, so here's where How are you doing focus-wise?
How we doing focus-wise, crew? Doing okay?
You guys are very quiet. Last time I saw people were like, I had questions everywhere. No questions? Please. Yeah.
Okay, so the people that were not affected, how did you keep them from getting Ebola from the people that were affected in the same zone? You didn't?
It's actually a good question. We tried. I'm glad actually you asked me that because I forgot that part. So in the early days before we got there, it was absolutely chaotic. So this was the old vocational school. The Sierra Leoneans were by themselves. The Ministry of Health did not do a great job. Ebola was militarized in Sierra Leone because the Ministry of Health really didn't do a good job in terms of mounting a good, effective response and building healthcare infrastructure. So basically, the military got involved. And this is why the military became part of my life. And if I saw one more AK-47 close up, I was just going to lose my mind. And the military put in roadblocks and checkpoints and curfews, and they were very much a part of the quarantine process for people quarantined in their homes. But that's not what, so I say that more, so that was October, November-ish, when the Sierra Leoneans were really, they were by themselves, while the cases just grew exponentially. So this was an old vocational school. Some of the buildings were an old vocational school. And so they literally made it into an Ebola treatment unit, which certainly was never its intent, which is why they were metal buildings and they were cement floors, and we had cholera beds in there. In the early days of Ebola, when the caseload was so high, when there wasn't international partners, these ETUs were death traps. The chiefs from the chiefdoms, paramount chiefs, would send their people to these Ebola treatment units. There was no treatment. The truth is even with treatment, the case rate, the fatality rate was still 60%. There was no treatment. There were not enough Sierra Leoneans to treat. There were not enough protective equipment. There was not enough training. People would walk into these ETUs. Many people died in horrific fashion in these ETUs. I knew the Sierra Leoneans who were very much involved in that. That's how I knew the story. When international partners came, we had a little bit more staff, a little bit more training, maybe some of the newer knowledge, a little bit more energy, right? And so that's when we started separating suspect wet, suspect dry in these suspect wards. Remember I said you could have a little bit of Ebola? So you could have a bit of a fever, a little body aches, that sort of thing, and really not be infectious. So let's say that a little bit, what you're looking like a little bit of Ebola winds up to be malaria, but if the bed right next to you has a lot of Ebola, so they're just vomiting in volumes that we've never seen in this country. Never seen, I'm telling you, no matter what you've seen, you've never seen vomiting in volumes that we saw there. Vomiting and diarrhea, certainly that's a big mess, right? But we did our best to separate the suspect dry and the suspect wet. Suspect wet, we had a little bit more index of suspicion that they might have Ebola. It didn't mean that families didn't cross over. Or in these horrible cases where we had negative baby and we were trying to find an orphanage, positive mom, we put in confirmed. Mom would sneak back through the gate because her baby was screaming all night and she couldn't stand it anymore. So it was really a trick. Really, really a trick. Okay. So, I call this is a very simple triage decision-making sheet that we followed all the time. And it was not simple at all. So all of these boxes, I mean, it's like you don't even, your brain doesn't even want to think about this, right? Because what arrow you're following. The point is everything looked like Ebola. So many cases went into suspect ward, and these were the decision-making triage flow sheets that we lived by. And this is in the Ebola treatment unit. This is my colleague Bree, who I will see in 4 weeks in Northern California. This is James, the national nurse. This is an Ebola victim. This is a sprayer with chlorine, and this is Chidi, a U.S. nurse, and this is one of the national nurses there. The ambulance is backed in to this area. The sprayer opens, he sprays the door with chlorine. He opens the door. This woman walks out. and they begin to triage. Now, I always chided Bree. Bree is not in protective equipment. I often was not myself, but Bree always got too close to that fence. But she didn't have Ebola, so that was good. Never got Ebola, so that was good. So Bree is working with James, the national nurse, to work on this triage form because we did a lot of training and supporting of our Sierra Leonean colleague to make triage decisions. And James was James took an Ebola nurse job, not really sure what he got himself into, was kind of floundering, and for whatever reason, James, Bree, and myself got along really super great, and we learned so much from each other once we sort of settled into this partnership. It was awesome. So they're working on triage together in the triage area of the Ebola treatment unit. And I just put this picture in because Chidi's a U.S. nurse in the middle. Bintu is a Sierra Leonean national nurse, was the best triager in the world. People didn't want to go to the ETUs. They felt like they were never going to leave. They often lied about their symptoms. And Bintu would do this whole triage in the person's native tongue, native language. And she would turn to me and she would say, "They're lying." And I would say, "Bintu, go at it again." You know, because she didn't need me. I just needed to support her. But Bintu would pull her glasses down. She'd look over her glasses, and the next thing you know, they would admit, you know, "Well, yeah, well, my dad died of Ebola." You know, that sort of thing. So Bintu really did her best to have a lot of integrity when she was triaging these folks. She was awesome.
Do you think people lie about their symptoms to get in there? Like, I know a lot of people probably lie so they wouldn't, like, have to go in, but do you think because of all the other places being closed?
Yeah, no, people were terrified of it. I think, unfortunately, here's where some interesting cultural things come in. You know how we very definitively as nurses define a fever, it's 38.2, or depending on your institution, 38.5, right? But you know culturally, how a lot of cultures don't have that definitive, you know, here's my, especially in developing countries, you know, when they'll say, "Oh, I have fever," because they just don't feel right. You know, they're short, you know, try to translate short of breath. Are you short of breath, right? So there was a lot of things, what I thought is people were very vague about what they were feeling, and we didn't have like this super way of understanding culturally what they were bringing to the table or communicating with them, even though Bintu was an awesome communicator. And so I think people got pulled in because they met case definition by symptomatology, but they didn't at all really have Ebola. So that was really hard. But people did not want to come to the Ebola treatment units. We got into a circumstance, I actually have seen this written about, and I actually wrote the author and I said, "Yep, it's true, I was there." I think I was there maybe for the third week, and I was out working in the community care centers, and I came back and we had 22 admissions for the day, which was really big. And Bree said, "Yeah, the chiefs are sending anyone in their villages who they suspect of having Ebola." She said, "They're not meeting case definition." And I said, "Bree, we have to send it back. We can't keep all these people here." She said, "Trust me, I tried." And she said, but the paramount chiefs are under threat of being flogged, we understand flogged, right? By the Sierra Leonean government and the Sierra Leonean military if they do not try to get these people into treatment. So they have absolutely no discrimination from who they're putting in an Ebola ambulance, and their communities will not take them back until they have their certificate that says they're Ebola negative. So that was the thing. So yeah, so that was finally written about. I think I was home after 2 months, and that's the one I wrote to the author. I said, "Yep, was there for that. You're right." So these guys decide they need case definition. Usually they do, and then this is the whole. This is the board that we all lived by, and this is the like suspect dry, and then who goes into suspect probable wet, and then so this is the 2 boards for suspect. And then over here it's confirmed. And you'll see, I don't mean to be love in that side of the room. You'll see right here we closed this off because we really had the suspicion that this person did not have Ebola, but we were waiting for a test to confirm that before we got into other treatment. And we did not want anybody, like at 2 o'clock in the morning, to put a new Ebola suspect patient in there. We were really kind of protecting that patient as best we could. And this is This is all the suspect. I stood here, this was my perch, and this is like suspect dry, and over here is probable wet 5, probable wet 6. And this is this very small, but very dark and sad, long road to the confirmed board, which is back there. So if you have Ebola, you're either being carried, wheeled, or you walk back into the confirmed board. And this is what I look like most of the time. And this is Chidi walking to me, asking me for something. This is one of my favorite pictures. This is the morning triage. This young man is John Martin, who called me Mum, the British Mum from the very beginning, because I have an older son named John who's a little bit actually older than he is. And John Martin had been in this Ebola treatment unit running it since the very beginning that it opened, and he was an incredibly mature man, but he missed his mom. So and I missed my children. So we kind of had this mom-son thing. So every time I see this, I'm so proud of John Martin. And he was running the board. You guys know that, right? In the morning report, you know, who's on first, who's sick, who's not sick, that sort of thing. And then over here is a U.S. doctor. This is a Cuban doctor, Cuban doctor, Cuban doctor, U.S. nurse, U.S. doctor, Cuban doctor, U.S. nurse, U.S. doctor, U.S. nurse. And here's one of the, I think actually this is Musa, who is a Sierra Leonean originally, has lived in Philadelphia for 20 years and went back to help his countrymen. So I love, this is actually the best time of international partnering, where we all sort of figured out what our day was going to be and how we were going to divide our teams. Transmission you all talked about, I just put this in because these were our 2 phlebotomists who were the only 2 people who had drawn blood since the minute this Ebola treatment unit had opened. Drawing blood was one of the most dangerous things. If you got stuck, like I knew as an American, if I was putting in the IV in or if I was drawing blood and I got stuck, I literally would get medevaced home, right? Because the potential for me to contract Ebola from a needle stick was so big that my non-governmental organization was not taking any chances. So these men were tirelessly to be the phlebotomists for us, and they're just great guys. And now I want to talk about a little bit of the treatment. So this is in fact me, and this is James, and this is our sprayer. Sprayer opened the ambulance. This man is very obtunded, can barely make it out. I think we're mostly carrying him. He's barely got his feet to the ground. He sits in the chair, and of course he passes out. So you can see I'm trying to get his temperature, and he passes out, and then he starts to seize. So James and I carry the chair over to our makeshift stretcher. This is a body bag on top of a piece of plywood on top of 4 metal posts, probably similar to what's there on the camera stand. And James puts an IV in right there. Well, I walk over, and so I have a seizing man, obtunded, and I mean, he's in the late stages of what we presume at that point is Ebola. I know he's going to die because he's just so sick, and once they get to that stage, they don't really do well. And so I walk over to the fence to my undressed counterparts. This fence, I would never come through here, and they would not go through there. This is definitely like, you do not pass that area. And I begin a conversation about wanting Valium. I just wanted Valium for this man because he was seizing. There is no morphine. The WHO will not let morphine in the country. Don't know why. So in all of West Africa. So we had many people who were dying, and what we had at our disposal was Valium. So a conversation ensues about how much Valium and IV fluids and that sort of thing. And so then we are giving him medicine, and then we finally get enough of a team together that we actually pick him up in that body bag, and we carry him through this fence, and he goes over into one of the probable wet wards, and he dies within a few hours. He was we had 17 deaths in 4 days from improper burial, where a woman died in her community. It actually was near Kefabulum, and she died and was properly buried, safely buried, and the family had great distress about it because they felt like her body wasn't cared for properly, so they exhumed her in the middle of the night, and we got like 25 different people from that one exhumation in, and the majority of which died, mostly because they came to care so late, because they knew what they did was not okay. So they were kind of ashamed, they were kind of embarrassed, so they kept themselves from care. That was one of the most difficult weeks for any of us there. I talk about And the most significant part about this picture is you can see I'm smiling for the camera. When the very first one I put my wellies on, and by the time I have my last piece on, there's like nobody's messing around, right? I'm very serious because I know I'm about to go in the Ebola treatment unit. It's 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I am a nurse. This is my name, and I was on the admit team. I sent this back to my family with the caption, "Does this outfit make me look fat?" So they didn't actually appreciate it that much, but I did. So, and then the dopping procedure. The dopping was over 24 steps. You know the whole concept of muscle memory, right? There's the art of nursing, the science of nursing. When you're learning the science of nursing, when you're learning a procedure, let's say you're learning how to put an IV in, or an NG tube in, or a catheter in, right? And it takes doing it again and again while you get the steps down in your mind so that you're successful each time. That's muscle memory. I'm happy to say at 51 years old, my muscle memory is still okay because I really relied on that to get me in the protective gear appropriately and then to get me out of the protective gear appropriately, because it's getting out of the protective gear where people are most likely to breach and expose themselves to Ebola or get exposed to Ebola. This was our very organized docking area. So these were all these different chlorine mixtures. Yes, we did have a huge chlorine explosion that was heard for a long way away, but fortunately no one was injured. And this is, Francis is standing here and he's looking in, and the clinicians are coming out one at a time of these areas. These are very difficult to get good photos here. First of all, your area is pretty stressed because, like I said, you're exhausted and it's the most likely place to breach. Second of all, right behind there is the confirmed area, and no cameras go into confirmed because what goes into confirmed does not come out. And then this is just another, if you're standing in the exit of the docking area, we use mirrors to take our stuff off, chlorine. And this is actually an Ebola patient who's looking pretty darn good because he's vertical. I don't think any of us meant to capture that. I was more focused on, what the doffing area looked like. And this was this was somebody wrapping around the fence, or putting a camera right up to the fence to get this. The very first process was our sprayers, and this was Pinto, I'm sorry, this was Pinto, and he's a bit crazy, although he's a nice young man. And Pinto would sit there and he would spray us, and he would spray the whole gown. This is 5% chlorine, and if that got on your skin, it was burning. This is why I was in triage. I was in the Ebola treatment unit for 2 days, and somehow I got a spray up of chlorine, which is scary for many reasons, if you think about it, because that could be aerosolized Ebola virus. So I got this significant burn on my neck, which was this big open wound, which of course you can't go in your Ebola treatment unit with that for about a week. So that's how come I got so much time in triage. I became not bad at it. This always answers the question of is it hot in there? This is green and this is all sweat, and I just need hair dye at that point. And then documentation is I love this topic because it's one of the most difficult things about being a healthcare worker in the middle of this crisis and a researcher, right? Doctorally prepared, so I understand research. I love research. Is that we really were not able to get in research protocols to find the best treatment, the best triage algorithms, the best way to do contact tracing, community surveillance, rapid diagnostics, treatment protocols, that sort of thing. I was there December and January 2015. The first case of Ebola was recognized in December of 2013. I watched the researchers come in over a year later. And that was really, and in the literature of Ebola and in the social commentary about Ebola in the medical press, that is a theme that you will see over and over again, was the lost opportunities for research, because it took so long to get research trials in for a variety of reasons. There's stark reasons and then there's other reasons. Into West Africa, that we were not, by the time the research protocols got in terms of rapid diagnostics and vaccinations and treatment protocols, the case numbers have dropped so significantly that there really is no good data that came out of it. However, the best thing that came out of this was this. So, documentation was a trick. As I said, nothing that goes into the red zone comes out of the red zone. So this includes pens, papers, medications, medical supplies. We were all paper charting. You had one inside the red zone and outside the red zone. So this is a physician and this is a nurse, and they're inside the Ebola treatment unit, confirmed unit. And I'm down here taking a picture. I've just come out, I doffed. Before I came out, I taped my treatment notes. I come down, I take a picture with my iPhone, and then I walk back up to the first picture you saw where the nurse had her arm in the air. And I document, what I did for what patient. Not because I looked at that patient, that piece of paper through the fence, but because I've taken a picture of it with my iPhone. And so the best thing that came out of it, you can see several pieces of paper there, was we worked with this guy, Eric Paraxlis, and he's a Harvard IT brilliant guy, and he lived with us and worked with us, and he was trialing the Google-sponsored Ebola-proof tablet. And this was really exciting for me because he was able to, he didn't have it up and running when I was there. He was trialing it. He wasn't inside the ETUs when I was there. He was just doing a lot of data gathering and seeing how the technology was going to work. And so what I love about this, because we talked a lot about the whole research aspect, and it was very disturbing, I think, for anybody who was a research mind. And what Eric said, and I love this, it will not just be used for single patient encounters, but for research on the virus too. So these are tablets that will stay inside of an Ebola treatment unit. They can be dunked in chlorine should they need to come out. They will communicate with a base computer, and they will data collect, but they also will do patient records. Eric emailed me about 6 weeks ago. He was on his way back to Sierra Leone. There's a few moments that will make me cry. This is one of them. This is a success. And he actually got some of these tablets installed into the Ebola treatment units. And he sent back these most amazing pictures of the changes in the country since the few months I've been back. There's actually hope. You can see it in people that you can see it in the children's faces and in the women's faces, and you can see this great training that is going on, hopefully to mitigate further spread of the disease. So this is the good news about what came out in terms of a research project out of Ebola. I wish there was a lot more than that, but good news. So this is when it gets, what time do I have? What time?
Until about 3.
3. Okay, this should do it. Nurses made all of these decisions in terms of what to do. So if you were Ebola negative, we discharged you. Many were still without health problems, and that became pretty dicey. What do you do with them? What do you do with a comatose patient? Which we had plenty. What do you do with an active TB patient when the government hospital didn't have enough, the nurses were not staffing 24/7 and they were still afraid, right? Even though the U.S. healthcare workers had a presence there, if you don't have nursing 24/7, how are you treating active HIV, active TB, active pneumonia, right? How are you treating a dehydrated, malnourished 1-year-old who has just spent 2 weeks trying not to die from Ebola, right? So it wasn't as simple as you call your local hospital and you get them transferred. If they're Ebola positive, you moved to a confirmed ward. If they died, they went to the morgue. If they were an Ebola survivor, and they were discharged. But what were they discharged to? Home. What was at home? What have you read? What was at home? Did they get a ticker tape parade? Yay, you survived Ebola? Stigma. I was stigmatized in this country as a healthcare worker. It was horrible. I still feel stigmatized. I'm still very careful about who I tell. I went to West Africa. I don't have even the beginnings, an inkling of what the stigma was like that these Ebola survivors experienced. Their people did not want them back in their homes. All their belongings were pulled out of their homes and they were burnt. We did our best to give them certificates. You survived Ebola. We did our best to touch them, i.e. Bill de Blasio hugging Matt Spencer, or Chris, Matt Spencer, the MSF doctor who got Ebola in New York City that set off this wave of fear and panic, which set off ridiculous quarantine restrictions. So the Ebola survivors did not fare well, even, and they had just, survived this horrific disease. And if they were unwell, sometimes we kept them in the confirmed ward because we knew we didn't have nursing care in the government hospital to take care of that. And so we did our best, even though we didn't have, bedside care. We would have episodic care. We would go in for, each patient would get anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes based on how high our census was and how much staff that we had. And then, we'd go out and there would be nobody for a couple of more hours. And then the Ebola positive moms, negative breastfed babies, oftentimes we would separate them. We'd put a negative baby in an orphanage. Mom, we'd treat her, and inevitably, all but once, the baby would come back and test positive for Ebola. So here's some pictures. This part gets a little tough. Normal day for us. How many adult survivors? How many children survivors? How many positive cases did we have? So we need to get them over to the confirmed ward. How many negative cases did we have? I can tell you for sure he died because I was the last person who saw him. He had a surgical abdomen and I couldn't get him into treatment. How many deaths do we have that day? How many people could I go to a government hospital? You see how big that, right? And how many lab issues did we have that day? Normal day. And then Ebola treatment unit, if you came out of this side, you were in the suspect ward, you were negative, and we discharged you. If you came out this side, you survived Ebola. Really, really one of the most hallowed spaces in the whole place. And Dr. Healy and I adore this picture. This is a young man who, he's a 3-year-old boy, and he does not have Ebola, he's negative. But you take all of their clothes off. There's no such thing as privacy. There's a nice fountain there. So our friend Tim, my friend Tim, and this young man are going over to the faucet and they wash from head to toe. And then Tim walks him back, puts him through the fence where I receive him, dress him, and he goes off to an orphanage. And this is the baby of the mom who died of the placental products, or taking the placental product. And, we did our best to take care of these babies. And this is the best example when I say that healthcare died in this country, or just stopped in this country. This is Capabulum. I'm in a community health center, a public health center. There's no one there. There has been no one there. There's supplies kept in there, so a community man let us in. And can anyone tell when caseload started to go up in Sierra Leone of Ebola? Right here. With any other health care for people who are suffering from malaria, diarrhea, acute respiratory illness, anemia, meningitis, or measles, when those health statistics were not tracked. Healthcare stopped. It still hasn't started. Jerry Octu is a 1-year-old survivor. She was written about in the Washington Post by Paul Farmer that said if we could only have, it was a principle of 3, but anyway, more people, more stuff, we could improve our mortality rate, which I don't know if that was true. And this is what I talked about. She's a little survivor. This is John Martin. She's got this little certificate clutched in her hand. John Martin, make sure he touches her. Make sure the community is out to see him touch her, hoping that this goodwill gets translated when she goes home to her community. She's an Ebola survivor. And this is what they go home with, right? They have nothing, and this is what the World Food Program comes up with. I mean, this is as good as it gets. This is peanut oil, this is lentils, this is rice, this is a blanket, this is the malaria net, this is a bucket for water, and in a perfect world we had boxes of condoms, but not on this day, we did not. And this is, if you survived Ebola, here's your door prize. And this is how they started their lives again. A lot of these were actually sold, right? So people went home to their communities and they sold. I mean, survive. What do mothers do when they have to survive and feed their children, right? Not great things. I went the wrong way. And then this is a perfect case. She ruled in for Ebola. She's 15 years old. She wound up not making it. Baruka was negative, went over to the orphanage. Baruka came back a week later, and he was Ebola, and he wound up not making it either. And I won't tell that story because it's too sad. and this is me, and this is a girl, even though she's in blue. You can tell if they're in pink. Really, that's a little boy, and she's in blue, and she's a little girl. It's mostly the clothes that we had. And I'm having this big conversation with my colleagues. I can tell you this child had a 7 month like I'd never heard. I went in, child just demanded to be picked up. I couldn't put her down. And I would try, but she would just, she was so strong. And she didn't want to see me. This is why I'm holding her. So I was scary to her. So this is why I'm holding her away from me, but I'm holding her. And this long conversation ensues about, is she positive or negative? If she's positive, I'm going to get her back with mom. If she's negative, I want to get her out of here to the orphanage. And she actually was negative, and as far as we know, never came back. This was everybody's got an I almost passed out story. This little wee one, she just wouldn't be let go. So I was in there way too long with her. And then this was just a normal, look at the ages. One day a 40-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 2-year-old. And then a couple weeks later, 10-month-old, 8-month-old, and then 2 67-year-olds. Ebola did not like the very young and the very old, like many viruses do not. The morgue, the burial team, and I won't tell that story either. And this was the 3rd cemetery in Port Local, which is where I worked in, just beautifully, meticulously maintained with a lot of dignity cemetery. Everybody had these beautiful plaques, devastating to this community and to this country. Community care centers, theoretically, so if I was here at Moforky, we also were in charge of these community care centers. Theoretically, they thought people would come to care more likely there because it's near to their community. Treatment would start, testing would be done, and if they were positive, they would be transferred to there. So I was able to do a lot of work and training with these community care centers. These are just pictures of that. All of this is training work. And this is the Victor, the African Union Nigerian doctor. And then that's it. So then the rest is daily life, which I know that's not what we wanted to hear about. So who wants to hear about what?
Why didn't that baby go to the orphanage with the sick mom? The placenta.
Oh, baby did go with mom.
No,
Why?
why wasn't baby just sent to the orphanage?
Oh, we were waiting for tests for both, so their tests came back together. Yeah, baby and mom. So I sent them off to Freetown together, but mom on the flight. Yeah. We don't know what happened to baby. We couldn't, things were chaotic. Yeah.
There's a lot of talk about proper burial. Is it just a difference of being actually buried under dirt and being buried under dirt?
So the tradition, and I don't really understand it. I really should look more into this. First of all, you have to think, what are our traditions? So I'm Irish Catholic, or I'm Catholic. So a lot of family togetherness, a lot of hugging, a lot of crying, a lot of thinking. And you've got the open casket, and you kneel at the casket, and you put your hand on the person's, chest, and some people might touch their face, that sort of thing, right? So I say this only as a way of understanding that every culture has traditions surrounding death and burial. My understanding of West African traditions surrounding death and burial is that it's a very intimate experience where it is felt that the person doesn't go into the afterlife unless they're basically, their clothes are taken from them, they're washed, people cry over them, people hug over them, people put them in their finest clothes. Now, one of the things we've learned about Ebola, this is some of the research that came out, is that you are highly virulent at death. So as if you're not contagious enough, when you got a lot of Ebola and death. HIV does this too, doesn't it? Doesn't HIV do that?
Yeah, it can.
Yeah.
AIDS can do that when you're dying with AIDS. You have a very high level count.
Yeah. So
It's not as easy to spread AIDS as it is to spread Ebola.
Right. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Absolutely. The way is, so you all know AIDS is just blood, right? But Ebola is spread. Like, let's say you have dried secretions, you have dried emesis, you have dried stool, that sort of thing. And all of this, is being washed from you, from multiple people in your family. And then you're shrouded, and then you're buried. So think about the physical contact on that dead body.
So it's really more the time of death, not necessarily bodies that have been.
Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, if it's improper burial, it's not, okay, this body's been sitting here for
Correct.
weeks and months, and they're still contagious. It's more the actual
You got it.
aftercare.
Yeah, absolutely, you got it. Yeah.
Although it is something where bodies that have been dug up, like in that example that you gave, were still had enough on them that
hugely
people
infectious.
were infected at that point in time.
I think they said 14 days they remain acutely infectious.
Is it because the body releases so much that
Don't actually understand the
or
science
not sure.
behind it. Yeah, no, I don't. I'm not sure anybody really understands the science behind it. Yeah, they just know that it's just a high viral load at that. Yeah.
What kind of process do you guys go through when you come back into the US?
Oh, okay, so I'm glad you asked that. Hold on, nice fast forward. So, let's see. Okay. So, long story short, the CDC categorizes people by no risk, minimum risk, low risk, and high risk. Any healthcare worker is low risk. It means you took care of people, clearly you had Ebola, but you were in full protective equipment and you did not have a breach. I'm happy to say that was my story. I was low risk. In 38 states in the US, you get to be screened at one of 5 airports. You come through one of 5 airports in the US, and usually along the eastern seaboard. And the CDC says you're low risk. Here's your phone, your Ebola phone, courtesy of the CDC, and we will be calling you twice a day, and you will report symptoms and your temperature. I do not live in one of those 38 lucky states. I live in New York State. The second, only to Newark, New Jersey, only to New Jersey, of the most restrictive quarantine measures. Completely against the federal guidelines, completely not scientific, but Governor Christie from New Jersey and Governor Cuomo from New York decided that to quell public hysteria, they were going to mandate returning healthcare workers to stay in their homes and not leave for 21 days, for the incubation period of the group. I had the misfortune of having to go through Newark Airport. There was 5 airports. Newark is the one that no healthcare worker wants to go through, mostly because Governor Christie has some pretty severe thoughts about quarantining returning healthcare workers. This cannot go on the media. We have to clean this up. Right? But this is also true. I mean, you read about it. And I had the misfortune of having to come through Newark on the day that school started for all of you, January 25th, I think. And the biggest snowstorm on the eastern seaboard closed all of air travel, which I found out fortunately when I was in Brussels, Belgium, that I did not have a commercial flight from Newark Airport to Rochester, New York. I also knew, because of my work with the state health department and my husband's work with the state health department, that New Jersey would not let me leave Newark Airport, because our original plan was my husband would drive down and put me in our little minivan with a porta potty, and we would just skate home, and we wouldn't stop anywhere. And the reason we would have done it that way is not because I was afraid I was going to give anybody Ebola, but think of what happened to the returning healthcare workers that became symptomatic, right? Hippo went out the door. Think of that. I mean, I remember being in New Orleans in late November in a breakout session of American Public Health Association, one of the largest, it's actually an international meeting of public health people, and a breakout session where ethicists said, where is HIPAA? Like, how is it possible that I know in California that the name of the MSF doctor who is now Ebola positive is Craig Spencer? How do I know this? Why should I know this? Where the ethics and HIPAA went out the door. I did not want this to occur to me. So all I could think of is if I get a fever from malaria, God forbid Ebola, I did not want every hour of my I know what happened in Craig Spencer's leg for 48 hours prior to getting Ebola. I should not know that. But I didn't want the same to happen to me. So my husband and I had this plan. He would pick me up, put me in the van, we'd have a portage on, and we would just skate home from Newark Airport. And no one would be the wiser where I would sit in my house for 3 weeks, even though it was nothing scientific. And actually, civil rights I had none at that point. I had no desire to fight restrictive quarantine measures because I was exhausted from my work there, and it wasn't my fight to fight. I fought my fight. I was over, I worked, at the front lines of Ebola. I was tired, and that wasn't my fight to fight. So I was the best quarantined person in the world. Unfortunately, the air travel closed on the eastern seaboard. So no one knew what to do with me. I was greeted, I was taken off the airplane by New Jersey police. You know, one of those, of course, I'm in the back of the plane. The doors won't open, the pilot apologizes. And then finally the doors open and Jersey police get on the plane and they yell my name.
Oh, you're not flying by yourself?
Oh, no,
It was a commercial flight.
commercial flight
Okay.
from Brussels. No, it's great, it's a great question. So I, of course, I pretend that it's not happening, right? Because I do not want, you know, at that point I would have taken the rap for being a drug mule more than I would have taken the rap for being an Ebola, you know, an Ebola healthcare worker. Can you believe it? That's how bad the stigma was. So, long story short, I get taken off the plane. They were lovely. The Jersey police were lovely. You know, they're all in uniform. They're very nice men. And they're close to me because they're like flanking me through the airport to CDC, where CDC is completely in protective equipment behind a counter going like this with the infrared thermometer. Yeah, no, guys, you gotta get closer. Yeah. But the irony, of course, is this is the CDC on that barrier, and the Jersey cops and I are like, yeah, so what's your luggage look like, you know? So anyway, long story short, I make it through CDC, I get my CDC phone, my Ebola phone, and at this point I have 4 Jersey officers, and they follow me, ma'am. So I follow them up the stairs, and they open this door, and there sits my 7-car, what do you call this, motorcade? And, you know, doors open, and 3 cops come out, put me in, put my luggage in. I'm in a black third vehicle, I'm in a black unmarked SUV. I've got 2 lights and sirens in front of me. I've got 3, including the hazmat critical incident vehicle behind me. And they say, we're gonna get you out of here, ma'am. I have no idea if this, it all happened so fast. I've been up for 36 hours. So their plan was, so there's a basement to Newark Airport, who knew? So the motorcade drove up through the basement or the bowels of Newark Airport over the tarmac where the big jets, you know, waiting for the jets. And we leave the airport, and one at a time I drop all the lights and sirens. They tell me the specific, okay, this is their jurisdiction, they're gonna drop off. Okay, now we're here, they're gonna drop off. And they take me to Penn Station in New York, which is on the corner of West 33rd and 8th Avenue in the snowstorm. And they deliver me to the very not so caring hands of a narcotics officer. I can't make it up. I keep saying this, I tell this, I can't make it up. And the narcotics officer sat in the back of his car for 2 hours, to which at one point he said, oh, you're one of the few people who sat in the back of my car without handcuffs on. So that's how that conversation went. And the whole time I'm communicating with New York State, who are great guys, and they're working with my husband, and we're trying to figure out how to get me out of New York, right? So New York got me out of Jersey, and then I'm in New York, but nobody knows what to do with me because all the air traffic is closed. They want to put me on a train, but they're afraid the train travel will close as well. And the last thing New York wants is possible Ebola patient on mass transit. But here's the logic. They won't let my husband take me from Newark Airport, Jersey won't. New York won't let my husband come to West 33rd and 8th Avenue and put me in a private vehicle. They insist on delivering me on public transportation. And you're going to go, wait, that doesn't make sense. Exactly, and that's where we'll leave it. At the same time, I have colleagues who go to Montana, who go to Colorado. They're out skiing the next day. Okay? So, long story short, they put me on a train with an escort who insisted that I sit on the inside because I might give Ebola if I was in the outside seat. I know, I mean, honest to God, but I think of me, I was so tired and I just kept making forward progress that, you just get through the day. So we get to Albany and New York State made it, and I shouldn't say this publicly because they really did make an exception, but by this time they had worked all day with my husband, who's a lovely man, and me, who was not so lovely at this point, so more my husband than me. And they trusted that we were, going to be good kids about what they wanted from us. So they allowed my husband to meet us in Albany. And so I get off the train with this escort. delivered into the hands of a New York State Health Department representative. My husband is there, where they take my temperature. I mean, it was just great. And I could either sign by court order my mandatory restrictive quarantine procedures, or I could sign voluntarily. And then they let my husband drive me to home, where I had someone from New York State in my home twice a day for 10 days. And then I had someone in my home once a day for another 10 days, and then I had to FaceTime. And let me just tell you, I had a variety of experiences. I had some nurses, public health nurses, that were awesome, and I had some public health nurses that would be in the driveway, yell through their cell phones, do you have any symptoms? Nausea, vomiting, you know, it's a 12 checklist. No, I would say, come in. They were like, I can't come in there. So they would come halfway into the garage. I had to hold the thermometer up to the window. This, you really can't make it up. Like, I honestly can't. I wrote this like the next day, so this is documented, like real time. So I had to hold the thermometer to the window to zero it out, because they didn't trust me. Put the thermometer of my mother in front of them, show it to them, as if they could see it 15 feet away from me. And then they would scurry out, you know, because they were like, ooh, Ebola, you know. And yet, then the next morning I would have somebody come in, hey, you got a cup of coffee? How are you doing? You need anything? So, you know, quite a variety of experiences. So, crazy.
Are you surprised that you were able to avoid, like, public notice of being there and whatnot, like, through all this, like, what you're describing, how, like, they quarantined you, even trying to get you
I
back
was.
home?
I was, because of course we live in a neighborhood. Yes, so my family, I have adult children, 21, 23, 25. I had a Brockport student at the time, he's now graduated. My family knew from the beginning, like when I told my children, this is such a symptom of how scary it was in the country in terms of the fear and hysteria. When I told my children I was going to go work Ebola in West Africa, my boys said, Mom, no one can know. This has to be a secret. You can't tell anybody. Oh, by the way, Mom, you could get Ebola, right? Like they led with this, our lives are going to be a mess. So they didn't have to remind me of that. I knew that from the beginning. The only people, it was truly a need-to-know basis. I was exhausted with secret keeping. And I frankly lied to people. My family all got on board with it because we were all so afraid to have our lives public. I asked Dr. Hebe. Dr. Hebe's a brilliant computer person. I asked her to take me off the website at Brockport because I thought at least I'm going to make it hard. If I get a fever and I get medevaced over to Buffalo, I'm going to make it hard for somebody to figure out who I am. Facebook, I didn't have much of a presence on Facebook, but we took my Facebook page down. So anything I felt like we could control, I controlled. I was a little paranoid with thought. You know, I did it a really different way. I was there with a lot of younger colleagues who have family that didn't work clinically, like as a nurse practitioner, or teach. You know, so they didn't have their footprints into their communities maybe as deeply as I did. And they were like Facebooking all over the place. But in October, a famed, now dead, died suddenly in Liberia, Pulitzer Prize winning photographer from the Washington Post was on his way to the not the Mailman, I'm mixing up, what's the Syracuse Communications School? Whatever the big communication school is in Syracuse, to give a keynote address to communication students about his experiences as being a photographer in West Africa. He'd been in this country for 21 days. Parents called the administration upon learning that a man from West Africa, a photographer from West Africa, was coming to deliver this keynote address at their school. Parents walked to administration, and administration disinvited this speaker, though he had been in this country for 3 weeks. So I had precedent, you know, I had a reason. I wasn't just paranoid. It was crazy. Yeah.
Why did you go?
Huh.
No, because you have family and the stigma and all the stuff that
Yeah.
you were paranoid about.
Yeah.
And
That's a good word.
no, I'm just wondering. I know, like some, you know, we all have a rebel in the family. You're gonna do what you want to do, and
I'm calling my mom. I'm telling her. I still am.
no, you know.
So, long story short. Yeah, long story short. People say that, and my flip answer was I was angry. I was angry. I was angry at the nurses, that I was angry at how nurses in the US were characterized. I was angry that the country was ignoring poor black people somehow, that just because I was white and suburban and born in the US, I had access to health care that, someone born in West Africa who did not have the same skin color that I didn't have.
I'm Nigerian.
Well, Victor, I didn't stop and tell you about my falling in love with Victor, this fabulous Nigerian doctor. It's all good, it's all platonic, my husband knows about it.
We won't know.
So I was angry about, I had gotten hemorrhagic fever myself from my work in Haiti. My time in Haiti called dengue fever, and it was really unfun. And I had incredible access to care, incredible access to care. I knew my primary care physician. I worked in the emergency department at the big hospital. I got into infectious disease right away, and I was kind of like, that was 5 years ago. I was embarrassed, embarrassment of riches of the sort of care that I got here. And it was really hard for me to understand what made me so angry was the U.S. focused on Ebola could come to this country, close the borders, close the borders, close the borders. Ebola could never come to this country. We have such a strong public health infrastructure that yes, might we get some cases? Sure. Absolutely, it's a potential. Would we stamp them down and get on top of it? Absolutely we would. Absolutely. So mostly I was really angry about the disparity of care. And I was in a place in my life, the big more emotional stuff is I had done some international work, minor, but some international work, so I understood how difficult it was, and people don't, and I had done emergency work, and I knew I was somewhat resilient, and, my children were older. I didn't have, horses to care for, a mother-in-law to care for. My husband is an incredibly capable man, and I felt like this was our job. It was our time to pay forward some of the embarrassment of riches that we've had over the course of our lives, and I could do it, And then I had an institution that really supported me. When many academic institutions walked away from supporting their clinical faculty to go to West Africa, made it very difficult. I was 15 people. I went with my original group. And all but I think 3 of us either quit their jobs and had to take leaves of absence. I was one of the few ones that didn't have to do that. So mostly for me, I felt like I was at a place in my life. I had the training and I had the background to do it, and it was I had to pay it forward a little. Thanks.
If healthcare workers did breach, what was the process in Sierra Leone?
So it was sort of a growing process. It depends on how significant the breach was. If it was a significant breach where you had a high risk, like you had a needle stick, you would get transported to Carytown, where the U.S. Public Health Service had troops actually running an Ebola treatment unit for American healthcare workers or European healthcare workers who were exposed. You talk about disparity of care. Because we had this horrible, horrible situation. I was here when it occurred, where the American from Texas had a big breach. Not only was he medevaced home, but they had 14 different people that they considered medium to high risk exposure to him that were medevaced home on 4 different, private flights. At the same time, Usman, I'll say this publicly because he's been in the New York Times, Usman, who we all knew, and he was John Martin's job, and we just loved Usman. Usman got Ebola at the same time. And the disparity of care between the U.S. healthcare worker getting Ebola and Usman getting Ebola was horrific. And a lot of us, of course, wanted, Usman to come to the U.S. to get the same care that we would have gotten. So I really wasn't truly worried about dying of Ebola, because I knew if I had a high-risk exposure, I would stand there like this, the helicopter would come get me, I would be taken to a biohazard containment unit where I would access. Craig Spencer said it best. He said, when I was in an Ebola treatment unit in Liberia, I took care of 36 patients. He said, when I was an Ebola victim here in the U.S., I had 36 doctors to take care of me, right? So I personally wasn't worried about about getting Ebola, I mean, certainly, you know, you think about it, and I was afraid, I don't mean to sound all not, you know, that I wasn't afraid, but I just knew I would have exceptional care if I did. So the process, you know, there were protocols in place depending on how big your exposure was. We had Ahmed people, you know, right there. Susie, there's a picture of Susie, she's an occupational medicine. She was our Ahmed nurse. We had to report our symptoms and our temperature to her every morning, and if we had a breach, we had a system in place to report that to her.
I have a question.
So, when you had these situations where you had children and parents with divergent or discrepant results, you had positive parents that had to stay, negative children, you talked about them coming back frequently, the children coming back positive. But in the interim, they were sent to an orphanage. So, was there any monitoring at the orphanage? Was
That's
there
how they come
concern
back.
there?
Yeah,
Okay.
several times a day. So they popped a fever, and they would be back. Here's a crazy, I'll tell the story, because it's almost a great example of this story.
I'm just thinking with adults, you have a better sense of, do you have symptoms, because we can verbalize that.
This is Abdullah. Abdullah's a boy. Abdullah's not with us any longer. Abdullah and mom came one time. Abdullah's mom was positive, and Abdullah's mom went into the confirmed ward. To tell you the truth, I don't know what happened to Abdullah's mom. We were so focused on Abdullah. Abdullah goes to the orphanage. He's there for 3 days, gets a fever, comes back to us. So the first time Abdullah rules out Ebola negative, right? Mom's positive, they're breastfed. We're like, how is this possible? Abdullah comes back the second time because the orphanage monitors fever several times a day. He pops a little fever, and he comes back. He's Ebola negative a second time, and he's got this excoriation, big fat chunky kid, you know, it's real sweaty. He's got this excoriation on his neck, and we think that this is a little cellulitis, and we give a little, I think we gave Mocmentin, and we sent him back. A week later, Abdullah gets a fever again. Abdullah comes back. This time he's Ebola positive, and he doesn't make it. We have no small amount of agita over Abdullah. All because so he's cycling in and out of the suspect ward. We were never worried about them infecting, exposing other children at the orphanage because of the whole concept of you can have a little bit of Ebola and not be contagious. And that is so true. So we sort of feel like if we had a better system, or if we had a faster test, you know, was he going to get, I mean, it's a 21-day incubation period, and this outbreak, the incubation period, anecdotally, was definitely like 9, 10, 11, 14 days. You know, it wasn't, 5 or 6 like it was on previous outbreaks. And so was Abdullah going to get Ebola? Did he get it from his mom? Or did we get him? We, the global we. That answer your question? Yes. Yeah. That's Abdullah.
So did he end up infecting other children there then?
No. So that's the whole, I want to be so clear on this, so I'm glad you asked me that. So in the early stages of Ebola, you are not contagious, right? So if you just have a fever, you're just not eating well, you're not contagious. And that stage lasts for 2 to 3 to 4 days. Body aches, fever, malaise, anorexia. It's when you convert to wet symptoms. So when you're sweating because your fever's so bad, or when you are vomiting, or when you have diarrhea, and people are helping, that's just not in the air. People have to help you clean up, help you to the bathroom, help you change your clothes, that sort of thing. That's where the exposure, that's why it's called the caregiver's disease. That's where the exposure occurs. But no, he could be rolling around in the crib or crawling around on the floor with a little bit of fever and no wet symptoms. We never had a sense, we were very close with this orphanage, we never had a sense that, holy Christmas, there's some, we're giving kids Ebola at that orphanage. Never did. Which is good. Yeah. No more? Everybody depressed? Nobody needs therapy? I think the take-home messages is, several things. I had, goes back to why I went, nurses, right? So it wasn't just the general lay public who was afraid of Ebola. You all were working, did you have colleagues, nurse colleagues, doctor colleagues who felt like we should close the borders and we had no business?
There were conditions during the whole war that they've been, come and peek at our Jewish patient, and we have guys come in. We have like similar symptoms, but not quite. But then I was referred to a doctor that things I wonder, she's just scared of everything, but we were really scared of catching anything. So she was panicking. Other doctors had to come right down and they're like, don't start a big fuss. I didn't think this was going to this, but she was ready to call it and go all crazy and excited about it. She was really scared.
So I don't mind scared. I mean, I had plenty of fear. You can ask Dr. He do that. I mean, it's one thing to make the decision, it's another thing to sign on the dotted line and get on an airplane, I don't mind fear. What I mind is ignorance and hysteria. So, and I saw that. I mean, I had nursing colleagues, and I had nursing colleagues who had nursing colleagues on the internet. And actually, I was in New Orleans, and the breakout session was run by the head of American Nurses Association, and she talked about this phenomenon. She talked about it publicly. And then we had a private conversation, and she talked about it a little bit more. And she said that they got a lot of, the ANA put out the ANA and the AMA and the American Hospital Association put out a position statement in support of healthcare workers, U.S. healthcare workers going to West Africa to help with the relief effort. And they had a lot of traffic on their feedback, a lot of traffic on their website. And for every one, she said this, for every one, yay, go, you go, girl, nurses are strong, they had a nurse that would say, are you kidding me? You're putting us at risk. You don't want to bring Ebola back to this country. Close the borders. We can't send our nursing staff over there. We're putting everybody at risk. Trained nurses, scientists. We're scientists, right? We understand microbiology. We understand virology. We understand science. We understand exposure, incubation, treatment, transmission. We knew it. People would say, we don't know anything. No, we have 40 years. We had 40 years. Nurses stoked the hysteria. Physicians stoked the hysteria. Not all of them. So that's one of the take-home messages is you are scientists. You get it. So if you're scared, I don't mind scared, but allow that scare to inform you and to make an informed decision. Don't jump on that bandwagon, right? Fear and hysteria, close the borders. I had nurse colleagues who said, it's going to go airborne, right? Because remember, there was a lot of confusion whether you could get Ebola, airborne or not. No. Short answer, no, you can't. Longer answer is some of the research we do have, the virus didn't mutate at all. If anything, it was a less virulent strain, if you can believe it, than previous outbreaks. We had healthcare providers stoking that fear, so don't do that. That's me. Go ahead.
One of the things we talked about in our first week discussion forum was the idea of quarantine. And being quarantined means something very different in this country. So you might be in a single room where people wear protective equipment coming in a hospital where you're getting care. But we were talking about quarantined in places where you can be quarantined to an area where you are well and there's a lot of sick people there. So someone who is perhaps in your situation in the suspect tent, you might be well, but now you're in with a whole bunch of people and have to stay where there's people that are going to be Ebola positive or are, we just don't know that. And talking about how sometimes you're quarantined in an area where you're with people who are sick, or sometimes you're quarantined in an area where you're sick and there's no health care at all available there. And that was a really big concept for people to think about because it's so foreign to our experience in this country. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Quarantine in Sierra Leone was really wretched. And because I did a lot of community health work, I would be on the roads in Sierra Leone often. And you knew the quarantine houses because there were large groupings of people gathered behind a rope, literally a rope, that was in front, tied around their house on some sticks. Sometimes there would be military with an AK-47 standing in front. these people could go nowhere. And the government still does not really function that well. And so they couldn't go out and get food. They were scared. If you're in quarantine, you either have someone that you know, you put on an Ebola ambulance to go into the Ebola treatment unit, or somebody died from Ebola, and so you're scared. There's no healthcare workers coming to check on you to see if you're okay. Your community is stigmatizing, they'll walk up to the military guy or walk up to the rope and they'll laugh at you or mock at you or they'll stare at you. They have a rope around your house. Really, really awful. No access to healthcare unless you got Ebola, and then you can call 117, the Ebola ambulance, which, when I was there, a young man who was 23 years old died. Unfortunately, I chastised him for waiting so long to get into care, not realizing what I was doing. And he said with big crocodile tears coming down his face, but I called the Ebola ambulance for 5 days. 5 days before, and the Ebola ambulance never came. So his friend put him in his car, drove him, dumped him out onto the road outside of the Ebola treatment unit, and then sped off. What about the friend? This guy had a lot of Ebola. We couldn't find the friend. So this is what people went through in quarantine, and go right now in the community I work with, there's 362 people in quarantine. The WHO, one of the only great things WHO did, is they do keep a fabulous website of real-time, up-to-date statistics about the number of cases and where they are, and the number of people under quarantine, and the number of tests, for Ebola, that sort of thing. So really different. So yes, I can complain a blue streak about my quarantine, but I was glad I didn't get sick because that would set off a hazmat vehicle and multiple response vehicles, and I had chosen I would go to Buffalo, not Rochester, and but my husband could come and go, and he could get food, and my husband elected to stay with me because we weren't afraid that he would get Ebola, or the same thing, my husband will tell you straight up, he goes, you know what, if I was going to get Ebola from you, he goes, I would have survived it. It's not fun, but, because we knew we had access to healthcare. So, it wasn't enjoyable, but I wasn't going to die or be stigmatized or socially isolated from being in quarantine. Yeah.
I have a question. I know that can sound a little bit harsh, but did you give any priority to the patients to get a little bit better chance of survival?
No, it doesn't sound harsh at all. No, you're fine. No, you're fine. No, we never made, so when I was there, we were transitioning over from, I call it the Hail Mary pass, so you have basically, this guy that's just, you don't know how he's still alive. So, you put an IV in, and you give some fluids, and you give some antibiotics. Even though it's a virus, there's a whole theory about why you give antibiotics. It has nothing to do with treating the virus. And, you give them antibiotics through the IV, and I call it the Hail Mary pass. And that was because there were so few healthcare workers, even before I got there, that's all, they were 40 and 50 patients a day. So you could only reserve that sort of aggressive treatment for people that were really on death's door. Bree and I made the decision, so when we were there, something called the Hastings Protocol was published, and it was a small sample size, it's controversial, where physicians felt that if you did aggressive care to any of your patients in suspect ward, aggressive care being IVs and a couple of liters of fluid and zinc and metronidazole and Cipro and ceftriaxone and vitamin K for the bleeding. If you gave all that, your outcome, in the Hastings protocol, the outcomes were better. Their case mortality or case fatality rate went down to something like 34% from the standard 60%. This was talked about for a week or so when I first got there, and protocol was written based off the Hastings protocol. And Bree and I, it hadn't been instituted yet, we were still doing the Hail Mary pass aggressive treatment. One day Bree and I were at triage, and we had 2 national nurses come in. So it was always, just as if one of your nurse colleagues got sick, it ups the game, right? It makes you just that much more intense, it makes you that much more aggressive, makes you that much more, I'm gonna save this one, right? These national nurses worked tirelessly for months before we got there, and they're still there. So in the national nurses, there have been over 800, nearly 900 healthcare workers in all of West Africa who got Ebola. Almost 600 have died. The large majority are nurses, not doctors, not lab techs, nurses. So we treated these nurses as we would want to be treated ourselves. And so Bree and I sort of did this little tete-a-tete, and we said, you know, we don't really have the progressive protocol in place, but we got IVs and we got everything, so let's do it. We kind of didn't look and put IVs in, and we started the aggressive protocol for everyone walking in the door. A couple days later, we were a little chastised for it because it wasn't vetted from, Partners in Health had thought of it, but the Cubans hadn't, really sort of bought into it. The Sierra Leoneans hadn't bought into it, but we continued to do it. It was all good. So I watched the transition go to everybody. So regardless, so that man who died, I was giving Valium to, yes, I gave him that. I also gave him aggressive treatment. Or, women that were walkie-talkie who could walk to the chairs, we gave aggressive treatment. Anecdotally, I will tell you, it didn't make a darn bit of difference. And that is some of the research that we're all waiting for. Not from Partners in Health where I was, because I can tell you that data collection was faulty at best. But we're waiting for some of the bigger papers to come out from some of the bigger Ebola treatment units to see if some of the treatment protocols that were put into place at the time that I was there were any more effective than basically pushing oral rehydration, salt, fluid resuscitation, that way, Tylenol, Zofran. I don't know.